Hello and welcome back to lesson number 2, Common Credit Issues. Now that you have a basic understanding of credit, let's talk a little bit about what to look for when analyzing a credit report. We're talking about all the most common issues you may find on your credit. It doesn't matter if it's your personal credit report or if it's a friend, a family member, or a client, everyone has the right to dispute anything which is questionable. When I say questionable, that includes any item you do not feel is 100% factually correct. Inaccurate could mean errors, mistakes and duplicate accounts, excessive inquiries, conflicting personal information like a misspelled name, the wrong date of birth, mixed credit files, where your father has the same name or it's mixed up with yours, or maybe even a stranger with the same name is mixed up on your credit file. Or of course, there may be identity theft or fraud, or when someone opened an account using your identity. This is all questionable. You also have the right to remove anything which is outdated. And when I say outdated, I'm talking about the length of time the account or negative item has been on your credit report. There are different rules for how long negative information can appear based on several factors. I'll teach you all of those rules in the next lesson, but for now, let's learn how to analyze and find those problems. Let's talk about how to spot those errors on a credit report. It's pretty easy to find them when you know what to look for. If you have a copy of a credit report, now would be a great time to pause this lesson, print it out, and follow along as I go through all the different sections of a credit report. Depending on the source of the report, the format may look different, but all credit reports have typically the same general 4 sections, which are identifying information, public records, credit history, and inquiries. Let's take a look at the identifying information section, also known as personal information. This area will list your name, social, current and previous addresses, telephone number, date of birth, current and previous employers, and sometimes even your spouse's name. So where do the credit bureaus get all this information? Well, whenever you apply for credit or an employer pulls your credit, or anyone else for that matter, they have to input the identifying information about you, and that information becomes part of your credit file. Human error is one of the main reasons why this information may be wrong. Accurate personal information is important for a few different reasons. One, you don't want to be confused with somebody else. Their bad credit may show up on your credit report or as a mixed credit file. 2, lenders check it, and if your personal information doesn't match up with what you wrote on your application, it can be a red flag and grounds for denial. 3, employers may pull your credit. Even insurance companies often check your credit. So here are a few things you can look for in the personal information section. Look for any incorrect or incomplete name that's listed. If you see your name misspelled, circle it. You want to fix that. Check your current address, then check to make sure your prior addresses are correct and complete. If they're not, circle them. You're going to want to correct those too. Make sure your social security number and date of birth is accurate. Your employment information is important as well because your employers will often check to make sure your name on your resume is not misleading. Look for incorrect, missing, or outdated employment information and make sure you fix it. Believe it or not, but sometimes you can be mistakenly identified as deceased. This happens if a creditor reports an account associated with a deceased individual, or if your social security number was reported as deceased. If you are accidentally listed like this, you won't be able to get a bank account, renew your driver's license, get health insurance, find an apartment, or participate in really any other normal everyday activities. Next, look at the public records section of your credit report. This section should include any court filings like bankruptcies, judgments, liens, lawsuits, and foreclosures, and they can have a serious impact on your credit report. Just like any other item on your credit report, there may be errors. This is what you should be looking for. Do you see any lawsuits appearing that you weren't involved in? You may see a bankruptcy filed by a spouse or an ex-spouse, even though you did not file bankruptcy. If you filed bankruptcy over 10 years ago, they shouldn't be there. Sometimes you may see a bankruptcy which is not identified by the specific chapter or bankruptcy code, and that's grounds for removal. Look for lawsuits or judgments older than 7 years after the judgment was entered or after the statute of limitations expired. And by the way, I'm going to go more in depth about how long items can stay on your report in the next lesson. For example, tax liens you paid more than 7 years ago, or maybe criminal arrest records that are more than 7 years old, should not be appearing. There are rules for how long information can stay on your credit report. Again, don't worry, I'll go over all of this in the next lesson, but if you haven't already done so, make sure you print out the bonus items in the beginning of the first lesson. You should go ahead and do that now. You'll find a couple of cheat sheets labeled Credit Time Clock and Debt Time Clock, which are going to be super helpful. All right, here's the big kahuna, credit history. This is where the most egregious inaccuracies usually appear, mainly because this is where all of your accounts, late payments, and collections are listed. This is what you really need to look for. First, keep an eye out for any clerical errors or mistakes. They can impact your credit score big time. Carefully review your accounts. Make sure all loan and credit types are labeled correctly. You want to look at each balance. Your balances determine your credit utilization ratio, which is a measure of how much credit you're using versus how much is available to you. If the credit bureau doesn't have the most accurate information on how much you owe and what your credit lines are, your credit utilization ratio could appear to be much higher than what it actually is. It's a really common error. Next, look at the status dates. The status date on each account is critically important because the date determines how long items can stay on your credit report. The status date can often be confusing because different credit report sources, like different credit monitoring agencies, for example, label them with different names. Sometimes one source will label the status date as the delinquency date, and the next may label it as activity date or last activity date. When it comes to how long items can stay on your report, what really matters is the date of first delinquency, which is the date you first missed a payment. That's when the credit time clock starts ticking. Yeah, so creditors and debt collectors are notorious for falsely renewing status dates to keep the item on your credit report for a longer period of time. So take a good hard look at each status date to be sure they're correct. This is where that bonus item I gave you, the downloadable cheat sheet called the Credit Time Clock, this is going to tell you how long the items can stay on your credit report. Okay, so moving on. Next, you may see that you have a mixed credit file, meaning that you have accounts or history for someone with a similar or the same name. They call these commingled accounts. But also be aware that if you see an account that doesn't belong to you, there's a good chance that it's actually fraud. So be on the lookout for identity theft or accounts that do not belong to you. So another mistake that doesn't happen that often, but it's still possible, an account that belongs to your spouse. You may see an account listed as joint, but only your spouse should be responsible for the account, but it's listed as joint. Also, sometimes premarital debts show up. So if your husband or wife had an account prior to your marriage that you never agreed to, that may be something you want to remove. Next, incorrect account histories, such as late payments when you paid on time, or maybe they were 30 days late, but you're being reported as 60 or 90 days late. When you see this, circle it because you're going to want to go after this item as well. Next, something I see all the time are post-bankruptcy balances. Creditors make the mistake of not reporting zero balances for debts that were discharged through a bankruptcy. You should definitely dispute them. Also, look for accounts that are incorrectly listed as you being the cosigner. Look for closed accounts incorrectly listed as open, because it might look as if you have too much open credit when you really don't. Sometimes you can find late payments that do not include the date of the delinquency. This would be considered incomplete and it's grounds for removal. Sometimes creditors will sell your past due account to a collection agency, so you may find a delinquent account that does not show that the account was turned over to a collection agency when it really was. Next, if you see overdue child support that's more than 7 years old, circle it. It shouldn't be there. Just double check everything and make sure you're circling anything that's inaccurate, outdated, or questionable in any way, shape, or form. Okay, the last section of the credit report, let's look closely at the inquiry section. As I explained in lesson number 1, inquiries stay on your credit report for 2 years. Soft inquiries don't impact your credit at all, and they can't be seen by anyone but you, so you don't really have to worry about those. Now, hard inquiries, they do hurt your score, so you should definitely look for any inquiries that you did not initiate or that are over 2 years old and get them off of your credit. Next thing I want you to look for is inquiries that you do not recognize. Circle them, because if you didn't give your permission, that's grounds to get them deleted. Next, look for excessive inquiries. What I mean by excessive is when you see inquiries that appear more than once, even though you only applied once. Car dealerships are notorious for this. You apply for a car loan, and they shop the loan with several or many banks. This results in numerous inquiries, and it can drag your score down. Now, although inquiries that are pulled during the same time frame typically have lesser impact than if they were individual inquiries, you still want to get them off of your credit report. The biggest takeaway from this lesson should be that your credit reports are typically chock full of errors, and you have the right to challenge anything you feel is inaccurate, outdated, duplicated, not yours, or questionable in any way, shape, or form. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to use consumer laws to remove these issues from your credit reports. So buckle up, this is going to be fun. Please take a few minutes to read the text on this lesson, then we'll move on to the quiz. You're going to love what comes next.